May 1941. Death rains from the sky. Thousands of German paratroopers glide silently over Crete, the jewel of the Mediterranean. Below, British and Allied forces face the largest airborne assault in history. No one expected an attack of this magnitude. No one imagined the sky would be filled with the enemy. But this video isn't just about a battle. It's the story of men who achieved the impossible. A British unit, completely surrounded with no escape route and nearly out of ammunition, pulls off a miraculous escape under the cover of darkness. If you want to learn about one of the most breathtaking escape operations in military history, minute by minute, detail by detail, you need to watch this video until the end, because this story is so real and so incredible, it puts Hollywood to shame. Are you ready? Then let's travel back in time. And don't forget to subscribe before we begin. Thank you. In the spring of 1941, most of Europe had fallen under Nazi Germany's control. France had collapsed, Poland was crushed, and the Balkans were burning. Adolf Hitler now set his sights on Crete, a strategic island in the Mediterranean. This island was the key to North Africa and the oil resources of the Middle East. Winston Churchill understood Crete's importance all too well. If this island fell, Egypt would be in danger. If Egypt fell, the Suez Canal would be lost. And if Suez was lost, the empire's lifeline would be severed. Crete had to be defended at all costs. Approximately 35,000 Allied soldiers were stationed on the island. Most were British, Australian, and New Zealand troops. Greek units fought alongside them. However, most of these forces had recently been evacuated from mainland Greece and had been forced to leave behind most of their heavy equipment. Tanks were almost non-existent. Anti-aircraft guns were insufficient. Most critically, air support was virtually absent. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had achieved total dominance over Cretan skies. The Royal Air Force had only a handful of operational aircraft left on the island. The sky belonged to the enemy, and this was a harbinger of the storm to come. On the morning of May 20th, 1941, just after 7 o'clock, British soldiers on watch around Malim Airfield in northwestern Crete witnessed a strange sight on the horizon. First came the sound of engines. Then the sky darkened. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of aircraft appeared on the horizon. Operation Mercury had begun. The German 11th Air Corps, under the command of General Kurt Student, was launching the largest airborne operation the world had ever seen. Paratroopers, gliders, transport aircraft, the sky seemed to come alive with movement. When the white and colored parachutes opened, both the island's inhabitants and the soldiers were momentarily captivated by the beauty of the scene. But this beauty was death itself. The first hours were a complete disaster for the Germans. British and Anzac forces were shooting the paratroopers out of the sky. The number of German soldiers killed before they could even touch the ground reached horrifying figures. In some areas, 80% of the paratroopers lost their lives before their feet hit the earth. Bodies falling onto olive trees, rooftops, and fields revealed the true brutality of war. One British officer would later describe that day. "We hunted them in the air, unarmed, defenseless, hanging from their parachutes. It was the easiest and hardest moment of war at the same time. Easy because the targets were clear. Hard because we were killing human beings, not machines." However, the Germans' numerical superiority and air dominance gradually began to shift the balance of hands. The fighting around Malim Airfield was particularly fierce. New Zealand units fought heroically, but holding their positions against the constant flow of reinforcements became increasingly difficult. On the morning of May 21st, a critical mistake was made. The New Zealand unit defending Hill 107 west of Maleme Airfield withdrew due to a faulty intelligence assessment. This hill controlled the airfield, and its loss would change the course of the battle. The Germans didn't miss this opportunity. Despite the airfield still being under British artillery fire, transport aircraft began landing. Each plane brought new soldiers, new weapons, new death. Aircraft would land, unload their passengers, and either take off again or crash as new ones landed on top of the wreckage. The runway was covered with wood and metal fragments, sand and blood, but German determination could not be stopped. It should be noted here that German losses in this operation were so heavy that Hitler would never again attempt an airborne operation of this scale. Crete became the graveyard of German paratroopers, but at the same time, it ended in a strategic German victory. Everything I've told you so far is just the beginning. The truly breathtaking part of the story starts now. If you enjoyed this content and want to discover the untold stories of World War II, subscribe and like right now. That way you won't miss our next video. Now let's continue, because the real drama begins here. As the last week of May approached, the Allied situation on Crete had become critical. The loss of Maleme Airfield allowed the Germans to receive continuous reinforcements. Fighting continued in the Kenia and Rethymno regions, but the overall picture was deteriorating. British forces began retreating into the mountains. Every withdrawal meant weapons, wounded, and hope left behind. The roads were filled with wounded soldiers and civilians. German Stukas bombed these convoys in low-flying attacks. Every bomb, every machine gun burst claimed more lives. It was in this chaotic environment that a British unit retreating toward the southern village of Sfakia found itself in an impossible situation. This unit consisted of approximately 400 soldiers. They were a group that had come together from different regiments and battalions, thrown together by the chaos of war. Among them were experienced sergeants and soldiers seeing combat for the first time. Command was taken by a 32-year-old captain. Although history hasn't fully recorded his name, his men held him in great respect. He was calm, determined, and above all else, resolved to get his soldiers home. The unit was moving through mountainous terrain, south, toward the sea, toward salvation. But the German paratrooper units were advancing faster than expected. Aerial reconnaissance was pinpointing Allied unit positions, and German forces were maneuvering accordingly. On the night of May 26th, the unit rested in a small valley. The soldiers were exhausted. They hadn't slept properly in days. Food was running low. Water was becoming scarce. Ammunition was critically depleted. But worst of all was the news. When a reconnaissance patrol returned, the captain's face hardened like stone. German paratroopers had cut off the unit's path. The only road south ran directly through enemy positions. German forces from the north were in pursuit. East and west were blocked by impassable mountains. They were surrounded. 400 British soldiers were trapped in the mountains of Crete with nowhere to run, caught in the middle of German paratroopers. Ammunition was limited, they had no heavy weapons, air support was impossible. Even if they reached the sea, they didn't know if evacuation ships would be waiting for them. Logic said to surrender. The laws of war stated that being captured was not shameful. But these were British soldiers. They were representatives of a tradition that had returned from Dunkirk, fought at Norwich, and never gave up. The captain gathered his officers. In the darkness, they spoke in whispers. No one knew how close German patrols might be. Gentlemen, we have two options. Either we surrender, or we infiltrate through enemy lines under cover of night. Silence fell. Everyone understood the risk. Moving through enemy positions in the darkness of night was a gamble. One sound, one mistake, one stroke of bad luck could mean the end for all of them. But a sergeant spoke up. His voice was tired but determined. "Sir, I didn't walk this far to surrender. We're going to the sea. All or nothing." These words captured the sentiment of the entire unit. The captain nodded. The decision was made.
They would infiltrate through enemy lines under cover of darkness. They would execute a plan that seemed impossible. Orders were given to the soldiers. Silence was to be absolute. No metal could clink against metal. No smoking. Talking was strictly forbidden. If any fighting occurred during the advance, only bayonets would be used. The sound of gunfire could ruin the entire plan. In the darkest hours of the night, 400 men held their breath and began to move. We've reached the end of part 1. Now the critical questions hang in the air. Will these 400 men make it through the German lines? Even if they reach the sea, will there be a ship waiting for them? And, most importantly, how many will make it home? If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button. Thank you. In part 2, you'll experience every detail, every dramatic moment of one of history's boldest infiltration operations. You'll witness the heart-stopping moments of coming face-to-face with German patrols, the silent struggles in the darkness, and how the impossible was made possible.
Welcome to part 2. The story continues at full speed. Night. Among the mountains of Crete, 400 British soldiers waited in silence. The moon had hidden behind the clouds as if trying to help them. The darkness was their enemy, but also their only ally. Around them lay German paratrooper positions. Ahead of them, passing through enemy lines to reach the sea. Behind them, surrender or death. The captain looked at his men one last time. He couldn't make out their faces in the darkness, but he could feel their presence. 400 heartbeats, 400 breaths, 400 hopes, all waiting for his signal. When the clock showed 11 at night, the captain raised his hand and silently lowered it. The movement had begun. Every detail had been considered for this operation to succeed. The captain and his officers had conducted the best reconnaissance possible before sunset. The approximate positions of German emplacements had been identified. The probable routes of patrols had been estimated. Most importantly, an infiltration route had been planned. The route followed a narrow pass between two German positions. This pass had probably been deemed impassable by the Germans because the terrain was extremely rugged. Rocks, thorny bushes, and steep slopes would normally make it impossible for a large unit to pass through. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was the only way out for these men. The unit had been divided into groups of 10. Each group was led by a non-commissioned officer or an experienced soldier. Approximately 50 meters would be maintained between groups. This way, if one group was caught, the others could escape, at least in theory. Final instructions were given to each soldier. Every piece of metal on their bodies was checked. Canteens were filled with water but left half full to prevent sloshing sounds. Rifle barrels were wrapped with cloth to prevent them from clanking together. Bayonets were fixed. Ammunition pouches were tightly secured. Recognition signals were established. When encountering each other in the dark, they would lightly tap the left shoulder twice. The wounded were the most difficult issue. There were 17 seriously wounded in the unit. Those unable to walk would be carried by their comrades. This would slow down the carriers and make the infiltration operation more difficult, but no one would be left behind. This was a non-negotiable principle. When a sergeant lifted his wounded friend onto his back, he said, "Tom, you carried me at Tobruk. Now it's my turn. We came together, we'll leave together." Moments like these showed the finest examples of humanity amid the horror of war. At 11:30, the first group moved out. A reconnaissance team led the way. There were 3 of them. One carried the compass, one had memorized the map, and one was the man with the sharpest ears. These 3 would be the eyes and ears of the unit. The first 100 meters passed relatively easily. The unit left their own lines and entered the no man's land. This was uncertain ground, controlled by neither German nor British forces. Every stone could be cover. Every bush could be an enemy. When the reconnaissance team spotted the first German position, they stopped. In the darkness, approximately 200 meters away, cigarette tips were glowing. German soldiers were on watch, but clearly complacent. Perhaps they didn't think such a large unit would dare to pass right in front of them. The reconnaissance team signaled. The main force would stop and wait. First, they had to make sure the pass was safe. Minutes passed like hours. For the waiting soldiers, every second was torture. In the darkness, every sound was amplified. The rustle of an insect, the flap of a bird's wing, laughter from afar. Every sound inflamed the fear of being discovered. Finally, the signal came. The way was clear. The first group began advancing, almost crawling. Through the rocks, under the bushes, they slid like snakes. Making no sound at all was impossible, but the goal was to be quiet enough that the Germans couldn't hear. When the first group cleared the pass, the second group moved, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. The system was working. But in war, no plan survives contact with the enemy perfectly.
When the fifth group was in the middle of the pass, disaster came knocking. A German patrol was coming from an unexpected direction. 4 German soldiers had gone out on a routine reconnaissance, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps from intuition. But now they were walking directly into the middle of the British infiltration line. The commander of the 5th group was a young lieutenant. He was 24 years old, and this was his first war. But that night, he showed composure worth years of experience. As the German patrol approached, the lieutenant silently signaled his group to lie flat on the ground. 10 men turned to stone in the darkness. Breaths were held. Hearts pounded as if they would stop, but no one moved. The German soldiers passed so close, they nearly stepped on the British soldiers. One German stopped right beside a British private. He took out a lighter to light a cigarette. The flame of the lighter briefly illuminated the surroundings. In that moment, the British soldier lying on the ground lived the longest seconds of his life. The German soldier's boots were only 30 centimeters from his face. Even if the lighter's flame went out, if the German leaned down a bit, looked a little more carefully, everything could be over. But it didn't happen. The German soldier lit his cigarette, exchanged a few words with his companions, and the patrol continued on its way. They had no idea. 10 British soldiers lay at their feet, holding their breath, and the Germans had seen nothing. Even after the patrol moved away, the 5th group didn't move for long minutes. They had to be sure. Finally, the lieutenant gave the signal to move, and the group continued on its way, trembling but safe and sound. If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button. It was past midnight. Most of the unit had crossed the German lines, but the danger wasn't over yet. Now a long march lay ahead, toward the village of Sfakia, toward the coast, perhaps toward salvation. The terrain was merciless. The slopes descending to Crete's southern coast were steep and rocky. This journey, difficult even in daylight, became a complete nightmare in the darkness of night. Soldiers fell, slipped, and were injured, but no one complained. No one wanted to stop. The soldiers carrying the wounded had taken on the hardest task. The weight of their comrades on their shoulders, exhausted muscles in their legs, burning air in their lungs. But they kept carrying, because those doing the carrying knew that if the roles were reversed, their comrades would do the same. At one point, the unit took a short break. The soldiers stopped to catch their breath and drink water. That's when they saw something on the horizon. Lights. Lights on the sea. Hearts filled with hope. Could they be ships? Could the Royal Navy have come to pick them up? The captain took out his binoculars but couldn't see much in the darkness. The lights were definitely there, and they were moving. They were either evacuation ships or German patrol boats. The difference between the two was the difference between life and death. There was no time for hesitation. The unit continued descending toward the sea even faster. At dawn on May 27th, the unit reached the hills above the village of Sfakia. Below, a small fishing village stretched out. Stone houses, narrow streets, a small harbor, and in the harbor, small boats. But more importantly, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of soldiers on the beach. Other units had reached the same place. Everyone shared the same hope, to be evacuated by sea. The Royal Navy was conducting an extremely risky operation. Every night, destroyers and cruisers approached the waters off Sfakia, taking as many soldiers as possible and transporting them to Egypt. The operation was extremely dangerous due to German air attacks. Approaching in daylight would be suicide. That's why the ships only came at night and had to leave before dawn. This meant brutal mathematics. The number of soldiers that could be evacuated each night was limited. Each night, some would board, some would be left behind, and the Germans were approaching. They were racing against time. When the captain's unit reached the hilltop, the scene was both hopeful and heartbreaking. The number of soldiers gathered on the beach far exceeded the ship's capacity. Not everyone could be evacuated. Some would be left behind, captured, or worse. Even on Sfakia Beach, British military discipline showed itself. In the midst of chaos, officers tried to maintain order. Evacuation priority had been established. First, the wounded, then combat units, and finally, support personnel. When the captain brought his unit down to the beach, he was met by a senior officer. He learned the situation. That night would probably be the last major evacuation night. The Germans were getting closer every hour. By tomorrow night, this place might no longer be safe. This information placed a heavy burden on the captain's shoulders. He had brought his men this far. He had led them through enemy lines. He had crossed the mountains. Now only the final obstacle remained, boarding the ships. That day, May 27, passed in waiting. The soldiers hid as much as possible and waited on the beach. German aircraft occasionally passed overhead, but there was no major attack. Perhaps the Germans thought the Allies were trapped and couldn't escape. They saw no need to hurry. With sunset, the atmosphere changed, both meteorologically and psychologically. A tension like electricity spread among the soldiers. This night was the night of fate. What would happen now? Would the remaining soldiers be evacuated? Subscribe and like. Let's continue. We're approaching the most critical point of the story. Will the ships come? Will our 400 men be able to board? You'll learn the answers to these questions very soon. We continue to discover the unknown heroism stories of World War II. Now, let's return to that critical night. When the clock showed 9 o'clock, silhouettes appeared on the horizon. The ships were coming. The Royal Navy had once again taken the risk. HMS Napier, HMS Nizam, HMS Kelvin, and other ships were approaching the waters off Sfakia. In the darkness, with searchlights off, they glided silently so as not to alert the enemy. On the beach, the evacuation process began. Small boats, soldiers packed into launches, were being transported to the ships. The process was slow, dangerous, but orderly. British discipline showed itself even in this chaotic environment. There was no pushing, shoving, or panic. Everyone waited their turn. The captain's unit got in line. There were hundreds of soldiers ahead of them. Time was ticking, and dawn was approaching. The ships had to leave before dawn or they would become easy targets for German Stukas. As minutes passed, the line moved forward, but not fast enough. The captain calculated. At this rate, only half his unit could board. The other half would be left behind. This was unacceptable. The captain approached a naval officer directing soldiers to the launches. He explained the situation. He said he had brought his men here, had led them through German lines and couldn't leave anyone behind. The naval officer was in a difficult position. The rules were clear, capacity was limited. But the determination in the captain's eyes, the sincerity in his words, changed something. The officer established radio contact with the ship. After a brief conversation, he returned and nodded. "We've arranged space for your unit. You'll all board. But hurry, we don't have much time." For the first time in days, a smile appeared on the captain's face. The unit quickly descended to the beach. Boarding the launches wasn't as easy as it looked. The waves were hitting hard, the launches were unstable, loading the wounded was especially difficult. At one point, a launch capsized. 12 soldiers inside fell into the water. In the darkness, among the waves, there were moments of panic, but other soldiers immediately rushed to help. No one drowned, everyone was rescued. This incident added minutes to an already tense operation, but the captain remained calm. He trusted his men, and his men trusted him. This mutual trust had brought them this far. They would overcome the final obstacle as well. As the clock approached 2 in the morning, the last group of the unit boarded the launch. The captain was the last one to board. Traditionally, a captain leaves his ship last. That night, the captain did the same thing. He didn't lift his foot from the land until all his men were safe. The launches were pulled toward the destroyer. The soldiers climbed up the ship's side. On deck, soldiers from other units welcomed them. They were strangers, but they were brothers in arms. Hot tea, blankets, first aid. Within a short time, the entire unit was on the ship.
The ship had to move before dawn. Engines were started. Anchors were raised. The ship slowly began to pull away from the Cretan coast. The soldiers looked at the island they were leaving behind. There they had buried their friends. There they had fought, suffered, experienced fear and courage. Crete had become a part of them, and they had become a part of Crete. The captain stood at the edge of the gunwale, looking at the island appearing in the darkness. An old sergeant came beside him. Both remained silent for a long time. Finally, the sergeant spoke. "We did it, sir. We're taking the men home." The captain nodded. "Not all of them. There are those who stayed behind. We'll never forget them." These words summarized the sorrow within victory. Yes, 400 men had been saved, but thousands of Allied soldiers had been captured on Crete. Hundreds had lost their lives. This wasn't victory. It was only survival. But sometimes survival itself was victory. The journey to Alexandria took approximately 12 hours. During these 12 hours, the soldiers finally relaxed. For the first time in days, they slept properly. They ate hot food. They dressed their wounds. But alongside the relief, the pain of losses was also felt. All 400 soldiers of the unit were on the ship, but not all were unharmed. Serious wounds, infections, psychological trauma. The invisible wounds of war would perhaps be deeper than the visible ones. During the journey, the captain visited all his men. He spoke with each one. He knew each of their names, knew their stories. This personal connection was the secret of the unit's strength. A young private asked the captain, "Sir, is the war over for us?" The captain thought for a long time. Then he answered, "This war won't be over for any of us. We'll carry what we saw, what we experienced on Crete for the rest of our lives. But for now, we're alive. And tomorrow, we'll be ready to fight again. Because this war is for freedom, for our homes, for our loved ones, and we will fight until the end." These words were addressed not only to that young private, but to the entire unit. And everyone knew the captain was right. On the afternoon of May 28th, the ship docked at the port of Alexandria. On the pier, a crowd was waiting to greet them. Soldiers from other units, officers, nurses, journalists.
Those returning from Crete were welcomed like heroes, but they didn't feel like heroes. They had only survived. They had only done their duty. The captain gathered his unit one last time. He gave a short speech. "I'm proud of you, each and every one of you. On Crete, we achieved the impossible. We passed through enemy lines, crossed the mountains, reached the sea. We did this together. We left no one behind. This is the highest honor of a British unit." The soldiers listened in silence. Some had moist eyes, exhaustion, pain, and pride all together. The captain continued, "Now you'll rest. You'll heal your wounds, but soon we'll be called again. This war isn't over. Until Hitler is defeated, we can't return to our homes. But I swear we'll see that day. We'll see it together." The speech ended. The unit dispersed. Everyone went their own way, but what happened that night would remain in all their hearts forever. We've reached the end of part 2. Our 400 men escaped from Crete. But the story doesn't end here. In the third and final part, you'll learn about the historical significance of this escape, the later lives of our heroes, and the impact of the Battle of Crete on the course of World War II. I'll also tell you about other breathtaking stories waiting for you on our channel, because World War II is full of thousands of heroism stories waiting to be told. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Thank you.
We've arrived at the final part. We continue at full speed. Alexandria Harbor, May 29th, 1941. When 400 British soldiers set foot on Egyptian soil, they were leaving behind a week of hell. The nights they crawled through the mountains of Crete, the breathtaking moments they slipped through German paratroopers, the relentless struggle to reach the sea, all of it was now behind them. But here was the truth. They weren't just survivors. They were men who had achieved the impossible. In this final part, we'll discover what happened after the escape from Crete, how our heroes' stories continued, and this operation's place in World War II history. We'll also examine what the Battle of Crete meant for both the Allies and the Germans, the long-term consequences of this battle, and how history has judged these events. If you're ready, let's raise the curtain on the final act of our story. The Battle of Crete went down in history as one of the bloodiest airborne operations of the 20th century. The numbers clearly revealed how devastating this battle was. On the German side, casualties were shocking. Approximately 6,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded in Operation Mercury. Paratrooper losses were particularly horrific. In some units, the casualty rate exceeded 70%. Around 170 aircraft were shot down or rendered unusable. These losses dealt an irreparable blow to the German airborne forces. When Adolf Hitler saw the casualties on Crete, he was horrified. Post-war assessments revealed that German leadership classified this operation as a Pyrrhic victory. Yes, the island had been captured, but the price was too high. Hitler never again ordered an airborne operation on this scale. Crete became the last major operation for German paratroopers. General Kurt Student would later say, "Crete became the graveyard of German paratroopers. We lost our best men there." On the Allied side, the picture was different, but equally painful. Approximately 17,000 Allied soldiers were captured. Around 3,500 soldiers lost their lives. Thousands were wounded. Most of the units that fought on Crete never regained their former strength. The Royal Navy also suffered heavy losses. During evacuation operations, 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers were sunk. More than 2,000 sailors lost their lives. The balance of naval power in the Mediterranean shifted temporarily
in favor of the Axis. However, the loss of Crete wasn't as strategically devastating as feared. The Germans had captured the island, but in doing so, they had expended so many resources that their other operations in the Mediterranean weakened. More importantly, the resistance on Crete had delayed the Germans for several weeks. These weeks may have contributed to the delay of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Though debated among historians, some argue that the delay on Crete played a role in the German army being caught by winter at the gates of Moscow. If this is true, the Allied soldiers who fought and died on Crete had unknowingly changed the course of the war. The story of the captain who led 400 men out of Crete didn't end with the battle. After a brief rest in Alexandria, the captain and most of his men were called back to duty. The captain was promoted for his leadership on Crete. Within a few months, he rose to the rank of major. His superiors had appreciated his composure, courage, and devotion to his men. Bringing 400 men safely out of Crete was no ordinary achievement. But for the captain, the real reward wasn't the promotion. The real reward was that his men were alive. Years later in retirement, he would say in an interview, "The most important thing I learned on Crete was that leadership is responsibility. Those men's lives were in my hands. Every decision, every order determined their fate. Carrying this burden isn't easy, but a leader must be ready to carry it." The captain fought for the rest of the war in North Africa, Italy, and finally Normandy. Each time he carried the lessons of Crete with him. He always told his soldiers the same thing: we leave no one behind, no matter what. When the war ended, the captain held the rank of colonel. But what he was most proud of wasn't his rank, it was the stories of the men he saved from Crete. Most of those 400 soldiers survived the war. They returned to their families, had children, lived their lives. And none of them ever forgot the man who led them through enemy lines in the darkness of that night. The unit's old sergeant remained by his side for the rest of the war. The bond between them had been forged on Crete and strengthened throughout the war.
The sergeant was a typical British soldier. He didn't complain, obeyed orders, and did his job. But on Crete, he had shown something beyond that. Leadership, initiative, courage. All these qualities had emerged at the most critical moments. After the war, the sergeant retired from the army. He settled in a small town, did gardening, and told stories to his grandchildren. But he never forgot Crete. Every year, on May 27th, he would raise a glass to honor those rescued that night. Once, his grandson asked, "Grandpa, what do you remember most about the war?" The sergeant thought, then answered, "The camaraderie. The worst part of war isn't death. It's loneliness. But on Crete, we were never alone. There was always someone beside us. Even on that dark night, we stood shoulder to shoulder. I'll never forget that." The young lieutenant of the 5th Group, who came face to face with the German patrol, rose quickly through the ranks for the rest of the war. His composure on Crete had been noticed, and he began receiving special assignments. The lieutenant eventually became part of British Special Forces. The SAS, Special Air Service, was being formed during this period, and Crete veterans were ideal candidates for this new unit. The lieutenant participated in sabotage operations behind German lines in North Africa. The night infiltration techniques he learned on Crete were now being used on a much larger scale. After the war, the lieutenant built a career in intelligence. He took on important roles during the Cold War, but he always remembered Crete. In the memoirs he wrote after retirement, he described that night. "When the German soldier lit a cigarette right beside me, my life flashed before my eyes like a film reel. My family, my childhood, my loved ones. In that moment, I understood how close death could be. But I also understood how precious life was. I survived that night because I didn't panic. I didn't panic because I trusted my training. From that day on, no matter how difficult the situation, I learned to stay calm.
Crete taught me that. The soldiers who carried the unit's 17 seriously wounded were the unnamed heroes of the war. History books usually tell of commanders, generals, and great battles, but true heroism is often hidden in the extraordinary sacrifices of ordinary soldiers. One of these soldiers was a young private named Tom. Tom had carried his closest friend Harry on his back. Harry's leg had been shattered by shrapnel, and he couldn't walk. Under normal circumstances, Tom could have left him behind. No one would have blamed him, but Tom never even considered abandoning his friend. While descending the mountains, Tom fell several times. His knees were bleeding, his back ached, his lungs burned. But each time he got up and kept walking. Harry, on his back, cried helplessly, "Leave me, Tom! You can't go on like this!" But Tom didn't even respond. He just walked. When they boarded the ship, Tom was on the verge of fainting, but Harry was alive. That was enough for Tom. After the war, Tom and Harry remained lifelong friends. Every year, they would get together and remember that night. Tom, who became godfather to Harry's children, became an uncle to the family. The two men kept alive a friendship forged in the midst of war for the rest of their lives. Before he died, Harry wrote Tom a letter. In it, he said, "Tom, you gave me life. If you hadn't carried me that night, I wouldn't be here now. My children, my grandchildren, wouldn't exist. Because of you, I lived a life. For that, I'm grateful every day, every minute." These stories show the human face of war. Beyond statistics and strategies, war is ultimately the story of people. If you find this kind of content valuable, please consider supporting our channel. By subscribing and liking the videos, you can help more people discover these stories. Now let's move to the final part of our story. The Battle of Crete holds a unique place in World War II history. This battle contained many firsts and endings. First, Crete witnessed history's largest airborne operation. Until that day, no army had carried out a parachute operation on this scale. The Germans opened a new chapter in military doctrine, but at the same time, they painfully learned the limits of this doctrine.
Second, the Battle of Crete showed how costly airborne operations could be. German losses were so heavy that operations of this type were never attempted on this scale again. Ironically, the Allies learned this lesson from the Germans and developed their own airborne doctrines. The successful parachute operations at Normandy benefited from the lessons of Crete. Third, Crete once again emphasized the importance of evacuation operations. Just 1 year after Dunkirk, the Royal Navy accomplished what seemed like an impossible evacuation. 16,000 soldiers were evacuated from Crete. Yes, 17,000 were captured, but those evacuated played critical roles for the rest of the war. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Crete demonstrated the power of the spirit of resistance. The island's people continued to help the Allies throughout the occupation. Secret operations, intelligence networks, escape routes. Crete became one of the symbols of resistance against Nazi occupation. Winston Churchill was deeply saddened by the loss of Crete, but at the same time, he was proud of the courage of those who fought. In a speech to Parliament, he said, "Our soldiers who fought on Crete heroically resisted superior enemy forces. Though outnumbered, inadequately armed, and lacking air support, they inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy. Their sacrifice is proof that Britain will never yield in this war." Churchill particularly viewed the evacuation operations as a success. Every soldier saved was a soldier who would fight in the future. Experience, morale, training, these were values that couldn't easily be replaced. But Churchill's most meaningful words were perhaps in his private correspondence. In one letter he wrote, "We mourn those we lost on Crete, but we give thanks for those we saved. Every single soldier is a family, a future, a hope. The effort shown to save them constitutes one of the noblest pages of this war." In 1941, America had not yet entered the war, but the American public was closely following developments in Europe. The Battle of Crete received extensive coverage in American newspapers. American correspondents praised the courage of British soldiers. The evacuation operations particularly garnered great interest from the American public. Another Dunkirk, wrote one American newspaper. The British have achieved the impossible again. This coverage influenced how the American public viewed the war. Months before Pearl Harbor, many Americans already believed they should stand with the Allies. The heroism stories from Crete strengthened this belief. When America entered the war, British and American forces fought shoulder to shoulder. In North Africa, Italy, France, the two nations united against the common enemy. The lessons of Crete played a role in this cooperation as well. Airborne tactics, evacuation planning, night operations, all carried the wisdom distilled from Crete's painful experiences. After World War II ended, Crete veterans began organizing their own memorial ceremonies. Every year in May, survivors would gather and remember those they had lost. These gatherings became a tradition over time. In the early years, hundreds attended. As years passed, numbers decreased, but the commitment never weakened. The gatherings continued until the last veteran died. The people of Crete never forgot the Allied soldiers either. On the island, there are monuments erected in memory of those who fought. Every year on May 20, the island's people lay flowers at these monuments. The Cretans who helped the Allies even under occupation passed this legacy from generation to generation. Particularly moving was the reconciliation of former enemies. Years after the war, German and British veterans came together on Crete. They held memorial ceremonies together. Former enemies now saw each other as human beings. Healing the wounds of war took years, but eventually it became possible. One German paratrooper veteran said to his British counterpart, "We were just soldiers. We followed orders. But now we're old men and we understand that in war there are no real winners, only survivors."
These words perhaps summarize the deepest truth of war. So what do we learn from this story? Why, more than 70 years later, is that night on Crete still worth telling? Because the story shows how resilient humans can be. 400 men, surrounded, hope exhausted, with no escape route, refused to surrender. Instead, they attempted what seemed impossible and succeeded. Because this story shows the importance of leadership, the captain didn't just save his men physically, he gave them hope, confidence, purpose. A leader who can find his way even in darkness can lead his followers into the light. Because this story shows the power of friendship, Tom carrying Harry isn't just a story of sacrifice, it's proof of what people can do for one another. And because this story shows the price of freedom. Those men left their comfortable lives behind and went to war. Some never returned. Those who did were never the same again. But because of the fight they gave, we live in a free world today. We've come to the end of this video series. We've experienced the story of the secret evacuation from Crete in all its details. I hope this story has been as meaningful for you as it has been for me. But this is just the beginning. World War II is full of countless stories waiting to be told. The little boats of Dunkirk, the siege of Malta, Bomber Command's night raids, the submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Each one is an epic in its own right. In our future videos, we'll explore these stories too. For example, in our next video, we'll tell of British pilots' heroism in the Battle of Britain. How did these pilots, so few in number, manage to stop the German Air Force? Why did Winston Churchill say of them, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few"? You'll find the answers to these questions in our next video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which World War II story are you curious about? Let us know. We can't wait to tell that story too. See you in the next video. Don't forget history. Remember the heroes. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye. This video is dedicated to the memory of all Allied soldiers who fought and lost their lives on Crete. We will never forget them.